Paul. All throughout Acts, we've seen that Paul was a preacher, a teacher, a theologian. He faced angry mobs. He stood and he spoke with clarity in front of governors, kings, people in authority, strangers, friends, enemies. And tonight we'll see how he was even a humble man who knew how to give sound advice and encouragement. That's evidence of discipleship, a transformation in us. The best time to give advice is when people ask for it. Oftentimes, when you give advice that's unsolicited, we come off as a know-it-all. Now, we're allowed to give our kids advice. That's parenting. We're allowed to give them guidance and direction. But as we disciple people, hopefully we're in a relationship enough to know that we can share what's on our hearts and what the Spirit's saying to us. Oftentimes, strangers won't listen to the advice if they don't know us. That's why building relationships is so important. You will hear the sound advice here in a little bit. Strangers don't listen to Paul's advice, but then they'll wish they did. Acts 27. It really reads like a classic piece of literature. I mean, it's vivid. Luke does such a spectacular job of describing the scene with all the details. It's like reading an adventure novel, but it's all true. So let's pick up in Acts chapter 27, verse 1. When it was decided that we, notice the we statement, Luke is back joined up with Paul after Paul's 2 years of imprisonment, really, Caesarea. Luke's rejoined Paul. When it was decided that we would sail for Italy, Paul and some other prisoners were handed over to a centurion named Julius, who belonged to the imperial regiment. We boarded a ship from Adramyttium, about to sail for ports along the coast of the province of Asia, and we put out to sea. Aristarchus, a Macedonian from Thessalonica, was with us. If his name sounds familiar, it's because we met him in Acts chapter 19. In Acts chapter 19. Now he's joining up Paul again. And it sounds like he may also be a prisoner because he's going to be with Paul through all this. Verse 3. Oh, another reason it sounds like he's a prisoner is because Paul says so in Colossians chapter 4, verse 20. He refers to Aristarchus, my fellow prisoner. Verse 3. The next day we landed in Sidon, and Julius, in kindness to Paul, allowed him to go to his friends so they might provide for his needs. From there, we put out to sea again and passed to the lee of Cyprus because the winds were against us. That's what you call foreshadowing. Verse 5. When we had sailed across the open sea off the coast of Cilicia and Pamphylia, we landed at Myra and Lycia. There, the centurion found an Alexandrian ship sailing for Italy and put us on board. It was most likely a ship full of wheat. All these ships, they often carried wheat from Egypt up to Italy, part of how their economy worked. Before they had, what do you call it? Jokes are funnier when you can make the punchlines. What's the trouble we're having now in America? Well, gasoline, inflation, baby formula shortage. No, but what, having trouble with immigration. The list is long. No, when you get things from one place to another. Shipping, goods and service, supply chain. I knew we'd get there. It's a good thing we're not playing $10,000 pyramid. Anyway, that's how the supply chain worked back in Paul's days. Boats of wheat from Egypt to Italy. Verse 7, we made slow headway for many days and had difficulty arriving off Cnidus. When the wind did not allow us to hold our course, we sailed to the lee of Crete, opposite Ceylon. We moved along the coast with difficulty and came to a place called Fair Havens. That sounds nice. Near the town of Lycia. Much time had been lost, and sailing was already becoming dangerous because by now it was the Day of Atonement. That's late September, maybe early October. Now, what usually happens, especially in upstate, Western New York, come October, November, December, January, February, March, April, wintertime. Back then, you couldn't sail in the Mediterranean Sea November, December, or January. It was just too dangerous. So, Luke's pointing out, we're running behind, and it's not good. And they're sailing into the wind. We've read that a couple of times. So here it is. Paul's about to give them advice. So Paul warned them, men, I can see that our voyage is going to be disastrous and bring great loss to ship and cargo and to our own lives also. But the centurion, now remember, Paul already had a relationship with the centurion. Such a good relationship, the centurion let Paul go see his friends at that one stop. Kindness begets kindness. Verse 11, but the centurion, instead of listening to what Paul said, followed the advice of the pilot and the owner of the ship. They had money to make. Since the harbor was unsuitable to winter in, the majority decided that we should sail on, hoping to reach Phoenix and winter there. This was a harbor in Crete, facing both southwest and northwest. When a gentle south wind began to blow. That sounds pleasant, doesn't it? They saw their opportunity. So they weighed anchor and sailed along the shore of Crete. Before very long, a wind of hurricane force, called the nor'easter. Does nor'easter sound familiar? I remember the first time I heard that word nor'easter, March 1993. The blizzard of 93. In my hometown, we got 3.5 feet of snow, and it was 10 to 20 below zero because of a nor'easter that caused the blizzard of 93. Nor'easters are notoriously bad storms. Now, back in Paul's language, they call this the Euraquilo. Sounds scary, doesn't it? Is it in the King James Version? Yep. Instead of northeaster, do you have Euraquilo? So the Euraquilo swept down from the island. The ship was caught by the storm and could not head into the wind, so we gave way to it and were driven along. Now, I don't know if you've ever been in this boat, but has there ever been a time in your life where it seems like once the problems start, they just seem to keep coming, wave after wave after wave after wave? Feels like a snowball, huh, Hugh? Yeah. That's what this storm does to Paul, the centurion, Luke, Aristarchus, and all of them. I think there's 276 on the boat. Things just keep getting worse and worse and worse. In fact, I tried to count in studying for tonight how many waves upon waves there were. So the first one I found was in verse 14. A wind of hurricane force, the Euroclyllo, swept down from the island. Verse 15, the ship was caught by the storm. We could not head into the wind, so we gave way to it and were driven along. As we passed to the lee of a small island called Cauda, we were hardly able to make the lifeboat secure. I guess that's wave 2. I missed it before. I'd be nervous if the lifeboats weren't secure. Verse 17, so the men hoisted it aboard. Then they passed the ropes under the ship itself to hold it together. That's wave number 3. The ship is going to fall apart. Because they were afraid they would run aground on the sandbars of Syrtis. Wave number 4. They lowered the sea anchor and let the ship be driven along. Verse 18. We took such a violent battering from the storm that the next day they began to throw the cargo overboard. Wave number 5. That might have been the wheat. That might have been who knows what. It's not good. And we're only on day 3. Verse 19. On the 3rd day, they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. I lost count. You get the point. One thing after another, it's snowballing. Verse 20. When neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, that sounds scary. And the storm continued raging. We finally gave up all hope of being saved. Did you hear what Luke wrote there? And think about all that Luke had witnessed with Paul before. Must have been pretty bad. He said, we finally gave up all hope of being saved. Verse 21. After they'd gone a long time without food, Paul stood up before them and said, men, you should have taken my advice not to sail from Crete. Not saying I told you so, but I don't believe that was Paul's intention, to kind of rub it in their faces, saying, oh, you were wrong. I think the point he's making is, it would have benefited you to listen to me last time. I have connections you don't know about. I bet you listen to me now. And I think he's earned it. They call that social capital. I think he's earned it. I call it spiritual capital too. Men, you should have taken my advice not to sail from Crete. Then you would have spared yourselves this damage and loss. But now, I urge you to keep up your courage. Wait a second, they'd finally given up hope. And here's Paul. Oh, he's not pouting on this side of the boat. They should have listened to me now or I want to die. He came over to encourage them. But now, verse 22, I urge you to keep up your courage, because not one of you will be lost. Only the ship will be destroyed. That's pretty specific, Paul. How did you get to that? Verse 23. Last night, an angel of God. Last night, an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I serve stood beside me and said, "Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand trial before Caesar, and God has graciously given you the lives of all who sail with you." That's powerful encouragement. I imagine, especially for Luke, when you think back on the other times that the Lord appeared, or an angel appeared to Paul to speak to him and reassure him that he would make it to Rome. And now it's happened again. Verse 25. So, keep up your courage. That's the second time he said, keep up your courage. We must run aground on some island. Either very specific, or because of his missionary journeys, he's familiar with the sea and what to do. Verse 27. On the 14th night. That's 2 weeks. That's a long time to go through some pretty stressful, hopeless stuff. They were so stressed out they quit eating. On the 14th night, we were still being driven across the Adriatic Sea when about midnight the sailors sensed they were approaching land. They took soundings and found that the water was 120 feet deep. A short time later, they took soundings again and found it was 90 feet deep. And what does that mean? Shallow waters. It's getting shallower and shallower. Verse 29. Fearing would be dashed against the rocks, they dropped 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for daylight. Did you hear that? Everybody on that ship's praying. In an attempt to escape from the ship, the sailors let down a lifeboat into the sea, pretending they were going to lower some anchors from the boat. Then Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, "Unless these men stay with the ship, you cannot be saved." There's a good illustration there, isn't there? Because basically the angel of the Lord said they would all be saved when they're all together. These other guys are trying to stray away. What's going to happen if they do? Most likely they'll die. And who knows what will happen, because they're not all together like the Lord said they got to be. So the centurion and the soldiers listened to Paul. Verse 32. So the soldiers cut the ropes that held the lifeboat and let him drift away. Even as you read this, you can kind of picture in your mind, like a movie, like, when they cut the ropes and there goes the lifeboats. It makes you wonder, was there some kind of confrontation then between the sailors and the soldiers? Maybe, maybe not. In the end, they all live. I think in the end, they're all glad they listened to Paul. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Verse 33. Just before dawn, Paul urged them all to eat. For the last 14 days, he said, you have been in constant suspense and have gone without food. You haven't eaten anything. Now I urge you to take some food. You need it to survive. Not one of you will lose a single hair from his head. You're right, Joyce, they're probably seasick. Seasick, and I don't know about you all, but when I get worried or upset, it usually affects my stomach. exactly, have no clue where they are. They can't see the sun or the stars. It's all dark. The Weather Channel freaks out when a hurricane lasts a few days, and rightly so. This one's lasted 14. But how bold of Paul. I mean, here's a prisoner. He doesn't let that label stop him. He really is kind of like the leader now, the one everybody's looking to in the midst of the storm. And that's a bold statement. Not one of you will lose a single hair from his head. After this, he took some bread and gave thanks in front of them all, then broke it and began to eat. I know it has nothing to do with the Lord's Supper, but that reads just like the Lord's Supper. He had taken bread, and after giving thanks, he broke it and gave to them to eat. Verse 36. They probably still kept it on the boat. I don't know what was in their tackle, if they had fishing gear, but they had a little left. They were all encouraged and ate some food themselves. Altogether, there were 276 of us on board. When they had eaten as much as they'd wanted, they lightened the ship by throwing the grain into the sea. There it is, Carol. Now it's all gone. Lighten the load. Verse 39. When daylight came, they did not recognize the land, but they saw a bay with a sandy beach, kind of just like Paul predicted, where they decided to run the ship aground if they could. Cutting loose the anchors, they left them in the sea, and at the same time untied the ropes that held the rudders. Then they hoisted the foresail to the wind and made for the beach. But the ship struck a sandbar and ran aground. The bow stuck fast and would not move, and the stern was broken into pieces by the pounding of the surf. The soldiers planned to kill the prisoners to prevent any of them from swimming away and escaping. Okay. If I was Paul and had taken the lead and had to just tell the centurion and the soldiers, keep the sailors from sneaking off in the boats, because if they leave, we all won't be saved. And now those same soldiers who did that are ready to kill the prisoners. Oh yeah, Paul's a prisoner. I'd be like, what are you guys doing?
Well, the centurions would be killed if the prisoners escaped.
That's a good point. If the prisoners were lost, the centurions would be killed, held responsible, probably the soldiers too. It doesn't say how many prisoners. 276. Yeah. But the good news is, verse 43, the centurion wanted to spare Paul's life and kept them from carrying out their plan. But he ordered those who could swim to jump overboard first and get the land. The rest were to get there on planks or on other pieces of the ship. In this way, everyone, just like the angel of the Lord had promised, just like Paul said in his encouragement, everyone reached land safely. If you need a break on YouTube, this is a good spot to pause it, make a new cup of coffee, and then come back to chapter 28.
Pete's note?
Yes, what's Pete's note?
This is a picture
Is this a picture of eternal security?
Use the magnifying glasses right here. Is this a picture of eternal security? If you stay with the ship,
If you stay with the ship.
the ark of the flood is a picture of this. And, I'm sorry here, you'll be safe, but you can choose to leave the ship.
If you choose to leave the ship, you'll die. For a minute there, I thought we were going to get in the big eternal security thing.
That's what I was thinking.
And like Pastor Denny says, you are secure when you stay with him.
I spent a whole day on a small boat being thrashed around on a lake in a storm, and I'll tell you, it was the longest day of my life.
Brutal.
I mean, I was maybe a freshman in high school, and it was bad. And
Yeah.
we had harnesses on, and we were lucky we made it back. But I could see land the whole time, and I was terrified.
Oh.
And I can swim. Some of these guys couldn't even swim. Think about that.
Yeah, they had to use the planks to.
Lots of people did not swim back then. Even fishermen.
And yeah.
They didn't.
And I go up to Lake Ontario, you may too, and you see how big it is. And the Mediterranean Sea, I mean, you're not far from when they thought sea monsters lived in there.
With mountains around it, it makes it so dangerous.
Yeah.
So dangerous.
And it's just so massive.
14 days. I was done after 1 afternoon. I'll tell you.
14 days. But I like how, I know it's not originally divvied up into chapters, but I appreciate how chapter 28 starts. Once safely on shore, because that's miraculous. Once safely on shore, we found out that the island was Malta. Malta's still around today. Here's some Malta history for you. In the year 1800, the British Empire conquered and took over Malta from Napoleon. And it was under the rule of the British Empire until 1960, which was handy in World War II because Malta was vital to the Allies' base for attacks in World War II. Interesting piece of history about Malta, isn't it? But in 1960, they were granted their independence. Verse 2, the islanders showed us unusual kindness. Another example of the way the Lord continued to keep his promise and provide. And do you see the grace when there's likely so many who are not yet believers on that ship? You see that prevenient grace, that grace that has gone before for them, that maybe draws them into relationship with the Lord. The islanders showed us unusual kindness. Hospitality. They built a fire and welcomed us all because it was raining and cold. Now, in the studies I was reading, it talked about how there's most likely some kind of shelter to get people out of the rain and keep that fire from getting put out by all the wind and rain. Verse 3, Paul gathered a pile of brushwood, and here again, this Paul's a good character. He ain't afraid of manual labor. He's right out there, not complaining, but getting firewood. And he's not a spring chicken. Verse 3, Paul gathered a pile of brushwood, and as he put it on the fire, a viper, most likely, does the King James Version say viper too? That's most likely recorded as viper to signify that that was a poisonous snake.
MLT says a poisonous snake.
Okay, the New Living Translation Bill has says poisonous snake. Driven out by the heat, fastened itself onto his hand. When the islanders saw that the snake was hanging from his hand, they said to each other, "This man must be a murderer. For though he escaped from the sea, the goddess Justice has not allowed him to live." Now, in that culture, in that part of the world, they believed in gods and goddesses, and the goddess name there is capitalized. You notice that? Justice. Or the name in their language was Nike, just like the tennis shoe. Or sneakers, as we say in Western New York. Verse 5. Paul shook the snake off into the fire and suffered no ill effects. The people expected him to swell up and suddenly fall dead. But after waiting a long time, seeing nothing unusual happen to him, they changed their minds and said that he was a god. And that's not a first either. Back in Acts chapter 14, people in that chapter thought Paul and Barnabas were gods. Zeus and Hermes, if I remember right. In verse 7, there was an estate nearby that belonged to Publius, the chief official of the island. I don't think that's coincidence. You think that just happened? He welcomed us into his home and showed us generous hospitality for 3 days. He must have had quite a house and quite a place to welcome 276 people for 3 days. Verse 8. His father was sick in bed, suffering from a fever and dysentery. Paul went to see him, and after prayer, placed his hands on him and healed him. You know what? This is actually called the Malta flu. And for century after century, this was a common thing, these symptoms with this flu. It came from unpasteurized milk or meat from goats or livestock on the island of Malta. And this poor guy had it. But Paul went to see him, and after prayer, placed his hands on him and healed him. How about that? Kindness begets kindness. Publius has everybody in. Paul heals his dad. Verse 9. When this happened, the rest of the sick on the island came and were cured. Now, you know what? You think it ever crossed their mind while they were praying on the boat, even those who were atheists? But I wonder if it crossed Paul's mind or Luke's mind. The Lord's going to heal a lot of people after we get through this storm. They probably had no clue what the Lord had in store for them. But how would they have gotten to Malta to do these miraculous things if they hadn't had to go through the storm first? And you see verse 9? When this had happened, the healing of Publius' father, the rest of the sick on the island came and were cured. They honored us in many ways, and when we were ready to sail, they furnished us with supplies we needed. And there it is again. Kindness begets kindness. You get what you give, huh? Not that we give to get, but that's just how it works. 3 months. November, December, January. They basically wintered on Malta. Verse 11. After 3 months, we put out to sea in a ship that had wintered in the island. It was an Alexandrian ship with the figurehead of the twin gods, Castor and Pollux. We put in at Syracuse and stayed there for 3 days. From there, we set sail and arrived at Rhegium. The next day, a south wind came up, and on the following day, we reached Puteoli. Verse 14. There we found some brothers and sisters who invited us to spend a week with them. There's something special about being here tonight, about being at church on Sundays, about being together with other Christians. This is the first time in 6 months that Paul was with another group, fellow Christians. I bet that was encouraging.
6 months or 2 years?
6 months. Because if you go back in the beginning of chapter 27, before they set sail and got close to Malta, they had some visits with some friends, some brothers and sisters there. But good question. And when he was in Caesarea, he was allowed to have some visitors. So, and the same thing happens in Rome. It's crazy even, we'll get to it at the end. Verse 14. There we found some brothers and sisters who invited us to spend a week with them. And so we came to Rome. The brothers and sisters there had heard that we were coming, and they traveled as far as the Forum of Appius and the 3 taverns to meet us. I could not find how far they traveled. Does that happen to be in Pete's Bible?
But all I know is 1 Thessalonians 4:17.
I think the point Luke is making is they traveled a long way.
43 miles from Rome.
Okay. So from Springwater to Rochester, they traveled to see Paul. 43 miles. At the sight of these people, Paul thanked God and was encouraged. I just wrote a note there, even Paul needed encouragement. We witnessed all the miraculous things just through this shipwreck and time on Malta, all the miraculous things the Lord did. You would think would be encouraging enough to be used as a vessel for the Lord. But still, Paul needed that encouragement. Verse 16, when we got to Rome, Paul was allowed to live by himself with a soldier to guard him. He doesn't waste time. Verse 17. I guess if you were in prison for 2 years waiting trial, you'd want to get down to business pretty quick too. Verse 17. 3 days later, he called together the local Jewish leaders. When they had assembled, Paul said to them, "My brothers, although I have done nothing against our people or against the customs of our ancestors, I was arrested in Jerusalem and handed over to the Romans." And like in Jesus' case, just to review, Paul was handed over to the Romans because they wanted him put to death. And the Romans could do that by their law, but not the Jews. Verse 18. They examined me and wanted to release me, but I was not guilty of any crime deserving death. The Jews objected, so I was compelled to make an appeal to Caesar. I certainly did not intend to bring any charge against my own people. For this reason, I have asked to see you and talk with you. It is because of the hope of Israel that I am bound with this chain. They replied, "We have not received any letters from Judea concerning you, and none of our people who have come from there has reported or said anything bad about you." I'd be curious to know if Paul had mixed feelings about that. I would be glad there have been no bad reports, but then I'd feel like I sat in prison for 2 years and news of that didn't make it out this way. I'd be discouraged thinking, proof that was unnecessary for me to be imprisoned. It was not an issue enough to communicate with people about on the other side. Anyway, I'm distracted by my own thoughts. They replied, "We have not received any letters from Judea concerning you, and none of our people who have come from there have reported or said anything bad about you." Verse 22. "But we want to hear what your views are, for we know that people everywhere are talking against this sect." They arranged to meet Paul on a certain day, and came in even larger numbers to the place where he was staying. He witnessed to them from morning until evening, explaining about the kingdom of God, and from the law of Moses, and from the prophets, he tried to persuade them about Jesus. Some were convinced by what he said, but others would not believe. The same fire that melts the wax hardens the clay. Some people accept, some people don't. Paul knew, as a disciple, he had to go and make disciples, share the good news about Jesus. And that's what he did. He tried to persuade them, but some refused. Verse 25. They disagreed among themselves and began to leave Paul after he made this final statement. "The Holy Spirit spoke the truth to your ancestors when he said through the prophet Isaiah," and he's going to quote Isaiah 6, verses 9 and 10. "Go to this people and say, you will be ever hearing but never understanding. You'll be ever seeing but never perceiving. For this people's heart has become calloused. They hardly hear with their ears, and they have closed their eyes. Otherwise, they might see with their eyes, hear with their ears, understand with their hearts, and turn, and I would heal them. Therefore, I want you to know that God's salvation has been sent to the Gentiles, and they will listen." Anybody else's Bible missing verse 29? Verse 29 is missing in some Bibles just because not all Greek manuscripts that have been discovered include that.
Mine says, some manuscripts include here, after he said this, the Jews left, arguing vigorously amongst themselves.
Yep. And that's what they usually did after they heard Paul's trying to persuade them to know Jesus. But yep, if you do have a verse 29, it says, after he said this, the Jews left, arguing vigorously among themselves. Verse 30. For 2 whole years, Paul stayed there in his own rented house and welcomed all who came to see him. He proclaimed the kingdom of God and taught about the Lord Jesus Christ with all boldness and without hindrance. And that's how Luke closes the Acts of the Apostles. And hey, Bob Gross likes to say, and we are writing Acts chapter 29. And may our testimony be like Paul's, that we do so with all boldness and without hindrance.